SEP Readings presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 5. What Bop Wishes. They were done with their shopping an hour after the shops opened, and long before the rush of students and their parents arrived. The shop owners, if they recognized her, didn't say anything. Theo, for his part, remained the overprotective brute he was. When people approached her, he acted like a bodyguard, scaring them off. As Hermione had no desire to talk to these people who wanted to gush at her and bring up the war, she really didn't mind Theo scaring them all off. They were sitting at the ice cream shop when a small house elf popped up and made Hermione let out a shout of fear. The elf's eyes went big, and then it started to cry.
"My mistress's baby,"
it said, throwing itself onto Hermione's lap. Theo gave her an apologetic look and said, Hermione, this is Bop. She was my mother's house elf, and I, finally told her about you this week. She has been rather beside herself since then." Hermione looked down at the elf and felt tears well in her eyes as she read between what her and her brother was telling her. This elf had obviously been very devoted to her mother, and known about her. It must have shocked the poor thing greatly that she had been found. The elf, seemingly not to care that they were in public, continued to blubber, and then climbed onto Hermione's lap and grabbed her face. Hermione's eyes burned, and she blinked. "What?" Theo looked up and froze in horror. "Bop!" Bop glared at Theo.
"Master Theo shouldn't wish to hide Mistress Maya's pretty eyes."
Bop didn't jump down from Hermione's lap, but turned around, putting her hands on her little hips.
"Bop is Mistress Maya's elf. Her mistress said so. That when she was found, Bop was to make sure she was well cared for."
Hermione gave Theo a terrified look and then said, "Oh, but—" Bop turned around and looked her over.
"Bop has made an appointment for Mistress at the spa, and for new robes. Young Master Theo wouldn't know to do this. Oh, my mistress used to tell me all she wished to do with you. Bop is going to do it for her mistress."
Hermione knew two things from this conversation. The Knots must treat their house elves very well for Bop to have no fear of Theo, and this was apparently very important to the elf. Theo was sighing and holding up his hands. "She won't take orders from me, Hermione. That means the paper has outed us, and she is allowed to publicly claim you." Hermione blinked and said quietly, "What did she do to my eyes?" Bop responded,
"I put them back. You have my mistress's eyes, and I put them back."
Hermione raised an eyebrow, and Theo cringed. "Our dad gave you a potion as a baby. It made your eyes brown instead of blue." Hermione gasped and reached up to touch her face.
"My eyes are blue."
Theo nodded. "The exact same blue as mine. We get that from our mother." Bop was crying again, rocking in Hermione's lap. Hermione put her arms around the elf and looked around. Everyone was looking at them, although, thankfully, that wasn't very many people. "Bop, please, stop," Hermione said helplessly as she tried to calm her own racing heart. She had blue eyes. Her mother's eyes? Theo's eyes? She wasn't sure how to feel about that. The elf nodded and tried to calm itself, although it still let out a pitiful wail. Theo stood up, grabbing their packages. "Right. I will take this stuff back to my town home." Bop stood up.
"I moved Mistress's things there. She shouldn't stay alone. It isn't proper."
Theo made a snort and had to hide his laughter. Hermione rolled her eyes. This wasn't her day, apparently, but she was too exhausted to fight with the still crying house elf in the middle of a public street. "That's fine. I think I will enjoy staying with Theo tonight before we leave for school." Bop nodded, the expression on her face rivaling Mrs. Weasley.
"You need to come with Bop now. She have to go to the spa and then shopping."
Theo smirked, although he looked worried. "Have fun, Hermione," he said, and then walked off with the packages, Hermione glaring after him. He was afraid of the elf, the traitor. Bop dragged her to the spa, where she got a full beauty treatment. It was actually rather relaxing, and she enjoyed hearing the elf tell her all about her mother, whom Bop had been with since before the woman had married into the Knot family, a family that Bop didn't like at all. Hermione learned that Bop was not, nor had she ever been, tied to the House of Knot. Instead, she had been tied to her mother's house, Brimage being the surname, and the house had died with her mother, which saddened her. When they were done with the spa, the elf dragged her off to get all new school robes and uniforms, new shoes, knee socks, and even undergarments. Everything top quality, and no matter how much Hermione tried to say she didn't need all of these things, the elf overruled her. Hermione had a migraine after an hour. This elf was a force to be reckoned with. Bop had her measurements taken, saying that she was going to make sure Hermione had the best muggle clothes there were. Hermione was a little frightened by this, but decided to not say too much. At this point in the day, she was simply tired of losing every argument. They were eating dinner now, and Hermione realized that Bop was sitting and eating and wearing a beautiful black dress. "You're a free elf," she said, putting down her fork. Bop nodded regally.
"Oh, yes. My mistress freed me before she died. She told me that I had a fault of my own, and that I was to wait and find Hermione, and make sure she was all right, and to watch out for her and Thea while I was waiting."
Hermione's eyes went wide. "Bop, you didn't buy my things, did you?" Bop looked scandalized.
"No, Mistress Maya."
Hermione frowned, realizing that it was all probably coming out of the knot vault. She would have to talk to Theo about that later, and maybe she could return all the stuff. "Bop, why do you call me Maya?" Bop smiled and said softly,
"That is what my mistress called you, her little Maya."
Hermione felt tears well up in her eyes and nodded quickly. "Bop, I would like to pay you to, be my elf." Bop looked up and smiled.
"I has already paid to be your elf. 3 galleons a week."
Hermione sat back a bit shocked. "Oh, well, wonderful." Bop nodded.
"I will go to Hogwarts with you. I has already met with the headmistress. She said I can stay and help in the kitchen."
Hermione tried not to show her horror. "You don't need to—" Bop shook her head at her.
"I will get a gallon a week to help. It is a good job, Mistress Maya. Bop is proud."
Hermione sighed and then nodded. "Well, the elves there are not very fond of me, Bop." Bop smiled.
"I already know all about you. You is famous among elves."
Hermione groaned. "Wonderful. That's wonderful, Bop." When she got home that night, it was to find Theo rubbing sleep out of his eyes as he sat on the couch drinking. She sank down next to him and grabbed his glass, taking a large sip and coughing. "What are you going to do at school with no fire whiskey?" she asked, handing the glass back to him. He snorted. "Bop might love you more, but she still loves me too. She keeps me supplied. Malfoy's elves keep him supplied. Zabini's elf keeps them supplied." Hermione snorted, cutting him off. "Basically, the lot of you bully your elves into bringing you fire whiskey." Theo grunted. "Bully? We usually have to beg and plead. You really know very little about house elves, Hermione. Bop, for example, didn't have to answer to my father. I got in trouble twice, once with her and then with him. They all raised us. They are like having another parent." Hermione frowned. "That has to obey someone or punish themselves." Theo looked at her. "Yeah, but we grew up with them. Sure, we are prats sometimes, but our parents were evil. A lot of us were only shown love because of those damn elves. I know about Dobby, and I am not going to defend the Malfoys. They could be horrible. But Draco's personal elf. She loves him, and he loves her." Hermione looked up in shock. "What?" Theo nodded. "He made her hide during the war. She stayed with Bop at my house. I wouldn't let Bop go back to Hogwarts last year, you see. None of us let our elves come back, actually. It wasn't safe." Hermione sat back, digesting what Theo was telling her. "I read that pureblood families use elves as whipping boys." Theo flinched and took another drink. "Yeah, they did. Dobby was Draco's whipping boy until he was freed. Then his father just whipped Draco. My father used an older elf that I liked." Hermione closed her eyes in horror. "Will you do that? To your son?" Theo grunted. "Never." Hermione nodded. "Good." Quietly, Theo said, "Draco won't either." Hermione nodded. "Why doesn't Bop talk about punishing herself?" Theo frowned. "I don't know, to be honest. She has been free so long it probably doesn't matter. She had no mistress, she just had orders. She used to punish herself when I got punished until I made her make an oath not to do that. I think if you ever got truly upset at her, she might try to hurt herself. Our mother loved Bop and was really kind, Hermione." Hermione found herself tear up listening to him. "Bop seems to be very devoted to her mother," Hermione said softly. "I'm happy that Bop didn't have a tough life, like Dobby did." Theo winced. "Look, our father was a bastard, but he loved our mother, and I'm pretty sure that Mum made him take a wizard's oath not to harm Bop. I actually have seen Bop go head-to-head with Father. Bop is why I never took the Dark Mark. She wouldn't let me, and Father couldn't overrule her." Hermione looked up in shock. "That's incredible." Theo nodded. "Mum knew the Dark Lord was toxic. My father wasn't always what you knew him to be. Bob had to see that too, and elves have magic, and if they are charged with guardianship, they can use that magic.
Hermione frowned as she considered this. So, elves are allowed to fight wizards?
Theo tilted his head, frowning himself. I'm not sure it's allowed, but it happens. An elf is permitted to do whatever is necessary to protect their charge. It's just not very common for them to be given that power, I guess you could say. Wizards don't allow that, if you will. Our mom did. She charged Bob with our protection, which pretty much means Bob can do whatever she pleases with us. Hence why your eyes are now blue. I told her not to do that, and she ignored me.
Hermione shivered. I haven't even processed that yet. Can we change them back?
Theo frowned. I am not sure. I would assume we could, but there's no stopping Bob from just changing them back to blue if we do.
Hermione tilted her head back.
Yep, no denying the migraine now.
Merlin, this is exhausting.
Theo sighed, and she felt him pulling her up. Come on, sis. Let's put you to bed. You can fight with Bob about it tomorrow.
Hermione shook her head. It took an hour to get her to stop wailing when I mentioned it after you left. I would honestly rather have blue eyes than break that poor creature's heart by asking for brown eyes back. It's apparently desperately important to her.
Theo nodded, wrapping a comforting arm around her shoulders as he showed her to the guest room. I am sorry, Hermione. I had no clue that she could change your eyes back, or I would have warned you. When she mentioned doing it, I thought she was joking.
Hermione shook her head in exhaustion. Just give me some time to process this, Theo.
Her brother gave her a kiss on the cheek, and she headed into his guest room to pass out in exhaustion. Shopping, she decided as she fell asleep, was utterly exhausting.